As the clock struck midnight, Michael Chen found an envelope stuffed under his apartment door. Inside was a check for exactly $847, the exact amount he needed for Emma's piano lessons, down to the dollar. No name, no return address, just the elegant handwriting, for the girl who paints music in silence. Inside was a second note that made his blood run cold. My wife's favorite melody deserves to live again. It had never been played in public, never been written down in sheet music. It had been a silent note, falling between sleepless nights, confined within the four walls of their home. Only two people besides Michael Chen had ever heard it, and both were buried deep underground. So when the words appeared before his eyes, fear not only filled his heart, but also took his breath away. The next morning, Michael discovered someone had tuned the old piano at Jefferson Elementary overnight. Perfectly, professionally, by hands that understood the instrument's particular quirks and temperament. Emma stood beside him in the music room, pointing to fresh sheet music on the piano stand. The composition was Claire's Lullaby, completed in the same elegant handwriting from the anonymous note. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said from the doorway, and Michael turned to see the school principal watching them with an expression that seemed to recognize something she couldn't quite name. "I don't suppose you know who's been visiting our piano?" But it was Emma who made the connection first, tugging on her father's sleeve and pointing between the sheet music and the principal's face with the wide-eyed recognition of someone who had just solved a puzzle the adults couldn't see. At 35, Michael Chen had learned to navigate the world as a single father with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that survival required careful budgeting of both money and emotion. 3 years had passed since Claire's death from cancer. 3 years since their small apartment had fallen silent, except for the gentle sounds of Emma's colored pencils moving across paper as she drew the music she could no longer speak aloud. The accident that had stolen Emma's voice happened the same week they buried her mother. Too much grief for an 8-year-old heart to process, the doctors explained, though Michael suspected his daughter's silence was less about trauma and more about choosing to communicate in the language her mother had taught her best. He worked as a piano tuner for the school district now, a job that paid modestly but allowed him the flexibility to be present for Emma's wordless needs, to read the stories she told through her artwork, to understand that healing happened at its own pace and couldn't be rushed by well-meaning adults who thought speech therapy might restore what love and patience were already mending. Principal Sarah Mitchell had built her career on making efficient decisions without emotional interference, but watching this quiet man and his silent daughter navigate their morning routine in her music room, she felt something shifting beneath her professional composure. The mystery of the overnight piano tuning bothered her less than her own inexplicable recognition of the melody, written on the music stand, notes that seemed familiar despite being certain she'd never heard them before. Sarah had spent the last 15 years eliminating inefficiencies from Jefferson Elementary, cutting programs that didn't directly contribute to test scores, maintaining the kind of institutional order that earned commendations from the school board and kept parents satisfied with measurable progress. But lately, especially since her divorce 6 months ago, she found herself questioning whether efficiency was an adequate substitute for the kind of education that fed souls rather than just producing data points for state reports. Her 10-year-old son, Marcus, spent his afternoons in the after-school program, headphones permanently attached, eyes fixed on screens that provided safer company than the peers who might ask uncomfortable questions about his parents' separation. Sarah recognized her own childhood loneliness in Marcus's defensive posture, the way he built walls around himself using technology and achievement, the same protective strategies she'd mastered during her own difficult adolescence. She had excelled academically as a way of earning love and attention, had chosen educational administration because controlling environments felt safer than risking the vulnerability that came with genuine connection. But watching Michael's gentle patience with Emma, seeing how he communicated through small gestures and careful attention rather than demands for verbal response, Sarah felt a longing she hadn't acknowledged in years. The desire to parent with presence, rather than just providing structure, to connect with Marcus before his defensive walls became as impenetrable as her own. The following week, Sarah found herself lingering in the music room longer than necessary, ostensibly reviewing budget reports but actually observing the quiet interactions between Michael and Emma. She watched him adjust the piano bench to accommodate Emma's height, watched him demonstrate finger positions without pressure or correction, watched Emma respond to his patience with the kind of trust that could only develop between people who had learned to communicate beyond words. Marcus began joining them after school, initially resistant but gradually drawn by Emma's gentle presence and the novelty of an activity that didn't require verbal participation. Sarah noticed how her son's shoulders relaxed when he sat beside Emma at the piano, how his defensive posture softened in the presence of someone who understood that silence could be a choice rather than a limitation. Michael found himself looking forward to these afternoon sessions, not just because Emma's joy was returning through music, but because Principal Mitchell's presence had evolved from administrative oversight to something more personal. He noticed how she watched Marcus with the careful attention of someone learning to see her child clearly for the first time, how her professional demeanor softened when she observed the kids discovering melody together. There was something familiar about her face, about the way she held her head when she was thinking, but Michael couldn't place the recognition that tugged at the edges of his memory. Their conversations remained focused on the children's progress, but underneath the educational discussions, Michael sensed a loneliness that matched his own, a careful guardedness that spoke of old wounds and the fear of risking new ones. Sarah began bringing coffee for both of them during these afternoon sessions, a small gesture that felt significant in ways she couldn't entirely explain. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond Marcus and Emma's musical development to include stories about their separate struggles with single parenthood, the challenge of balancing professional responsibilities with children's needs, the way grief and divorce left similar scars despite their different origins. Michael spoke about Claire with the gentle reverence of someone who had learned to carry love and loss simultaneously, while Sarah shared her fears about losing connection with Marcus in her efforts to provide him with stability and security. Neither pushed for deeper revelations, but the comfortable silence that developed between them felt like the beginning of trust, the recognition that some healing happened through presence rather than confession. The afternoon when everything changed began like any other, with Michael tuning the piano while Emma and Marcus practiced simple melodies together. Sarah was reviewing enrollment projections when she noticed a man in an expensive suit standing in the hallway, watching the music room with the intense focus of someone seeking answers to questions he'd carried for years. He stepped into the room with the careful movements of someone approaching something precious and fragile, his eyes fixed on Emma with recognition that made Sarah's chest tighten with inexplicable anxiety. "That melody," he said, his voice carrying decades of longing and regret. "I wrote that song 30 years ago for my daughter." Michael stood slowly, positioning himself protectively near Emma, but the child seemed unafraid of the stranger. Instead, she looked up at him with curious eyes and continued playing, her small fingers finding variations in the melody that made it sound both achingly familiar and entirely new. "I'm Theodore Mitchell," the man continued, his gaze shifting between Emma and Sarah with growing wonder. "I've been searching for that song since my daughter stopped speaking to me 23 years ago." Sarah felt her world tilt sideways as she processed the implications of his words, the impossible coincidence that felt too meaningful to be mere chance. The name Mitchell, the familiar bone structure in his face, the way his eyes held the same intensity she saw in her own mirror each morning. Suddenly, pieces of her family puzzle began clicking into place with devastating clarity. "Sarah?" Theodore whispered, recognition flooding his features as he looked at the woman standing frozen behind the principal's desk. "My God, Sarah, is that really you?" The silence that followed felt electric with recognition and the promise of everything about to change. Emma's playing had stopped, but her hands remained on the keys as if ready to provide soundtrack for whatever revelation was about to unfold. Michael moved closer to Sarah, instinctively offering support for whatever shock she was processing, while Marcus watched from his corner with wide eyes that reflected the adult drama unfolding beyond his understanding. "Dad?" Sarah's voice emerged smaller than she intended, carrying 23 years of anger and hurt and longing she thought she had successfully buried beneath professional accomplishments and carefully managed expectations. Theodore's face crumpled with relief and regret, and suddenly Sarah was 8 years old again, sitting at her childhood piano while her father composed melodies that made their small house feel magical, before her mother's ultimatums had forced her to choose between her parents' marriage and her musical dreams. "You wrote that song for me," Sarah said, the words emerging from a place deeper than memory, from the part of her heart that had never stopped being her father's daughter, despite decades of silence and stubborn pride. Theodore nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks as he looked between Sarah and Emma, seeing connections that had been invisible until this moment. "I wrote it the day you were born," he confirmed, his voice breaking with 23 years of suppressed emotion. "And I've played it every night since you stopped taking my calls, hoping somehow you'd hear it and come home." Emma stood from the piano bench and walked to Theodore with the fearless compassion that had made her a bridge between so many hearts. She took his weathered hand in her small one and led him back to the piano, pressing his fingers to the keys and nodding encouragingly, as if she understood that this was a conversation that needed music to complete. Michael watched this reunion with the complicated emotions of someone who understood both the joy of unexpected connection and the pain of relationships severed by misunderstanding and pride. The mystery of the anonymous envelope was beginning to resolve itself in ways that felt both impossible and inevitable. Theodore must have been watching Sarah from a distance, must have discovered her connection to Emma through the network of concern that connected people who cared about the same small girl. But even as the practical explanations emerged, Michael felt something larger at work. The kind of meaningful coincidence that suggested the universe occasionally conspired to heal what seemed irretrievably broken. Emma's role as catalyst was becoming clear. Her wordless communication had somehow created space for truths that adults had spent years avoiding, her gentle presence making it safe for people to risk the vulnerability that forgiveness required. The weeks that followed transformed Jefferson Elementary's music room into something unprecedented in the school's efficiently managed halls. Theodore began visiting daily, bringing with him stories of Sarah's musical childhood that she had thought lost forever, along with compositions he had continued writing for the daughter who wouldn't speak to him but never left his heart. Sarah found herself remembering the girl she had been before efficiency and achievement had become her primary languages. The child who had found magic in melodies and possibility in improvisation. Marcus, overwhelmed by the adult drama but fascinated by his grandfather's sudden appearance, discovered that genetic musical ability was apparently stronger than years of neglect. His playing evolved rapidly under Theodore's patient instruction, as if his hands had been waiting all along for the right teacher to unlock their potential. But the growing closeness between Sarah and her father also revealed the depth of the chasm that had opened between Sarah and Michael. The cashier's check had come from Theodore, Sarah learned, along with the completed lullaby that he had somehow obtained from Claire's personal effects years earlier. The revelation that Sarah's father had been watching their family from a distance, that he had known about Claire's death and Emma's silence without ever reaching out directly, created a complex web of connection and surveillance that made Michael deeply uncomfortable. Sarah's transformation from efficient administrator to vulnerable daughter was beautiful to witness, but it also highlighted the differences between their worlds. Her family's wealth and artistic legacy versus his working-class struggles and daily survival concerns. The careful equality they had built during their afternoon conversations began to feel artificial, overshadowed by the reality that Sarah had resources and connections Michael could never hope to match. The breaking point came during a school board meeting, where Theodore's presence and generous offer to fund a comprehensive music program forced Sarah to choose between her professional identity and her newly reclaimed relationship with her father. Board members who had praised her efficiency now questioned her judgment, suggesting that personal relationships were compromising her administrative objectivity. Michael watched from the back of the room as Sarah defended the music program with passion he'd never seen her display for any bureaucratic initiative. But he also saw how naturally she navigated the world of board politics and institutional power, how her vocabulary shifted into registers of privilege and authority that excluded him entirely. When Theodore stood to address the board, speaking eloquently about arts education and community investment, Michael felt the full weight of his own outsider status, in Sarah's suddenly expanded world. The confrontation between Sarah and Michael happened in the empty music room after the board meeting, their carefully built trust colliding with the reality of their different circumstances. "You could have told me about your father," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying hurt rather than anger. "You let me think you were just a single parent, struggling like I am, when all along you had family wealth and connections I can't even imagine." Sarah's response revealed her own confusion and pain. She had genuinely believed herself cut off from her father's world, had built her identity around self-sufficiency and professional achievement precisely because she thought the musical part of her heritage was lost forever. But Michael's perspective forced her to recognize how her financial security, her professional status, her ability to make choices without calculating survival costs, had always separated their experiences, despite the surface similarities of single parenthood. Emma's response to the growing tension between the adults was to retreat into deeper silence, her drawings becoming darker and more abstract as she sensed the connections she had helped create were fragmenting. Marcus, caught between his mother's emotional upheaval and his growing attachment to Michael and Emma, began acting out in ways that reflected the adults' unspoken conflicts. The music room, which had become a sanctuary of healing and connection, now felt charged with unresolved tensions and competing loyalties. Michael found himself avoiding the school entirely, picking Emma up from her classroom rather than risking encounters with Sarah that left both of them feeling raw and misunderstood. The anonymous kindness of the mysterious benefactor had been replaced by the complicated reality of family dynamics and class differences that no amount of good intentions could easily resolve. The accident that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening when Michael's ancient Honda broke down on the way home from Emma's doctor appointment. He had been walking along the highway shoulder, carrying Emma and their wet groceries, when Sarah's car appeared through the rain like an answer to a prayer he'd been too proud to speak aloud. She pulled over without hesitation, her professional composure dissolving into genuine concern as she saw their soaked condition and Emma's exhausted face. The drive to Michael's apartment was conducted in careful silence, but Sarah's presence in his modest living space felt significant in ways that transcended their recent conflicts. She helped him get Emma into dry clothes, made tea without being asked, and stayed to ensure the fever that had prompted the doctor visit wasn't getting worse. Watching Sarah move through his small kitchen with natural grace, seeing her read to Emma while he fixed their broken heater, Michael realized that her privilege hadn't made her incapable of genuine care. It had simply given her different tools for expressing it. When Emma fell asleep in Sarah's arms, her small hand clutching the principal's sleeve with trust that seemed to bridge all the complications the adults had created, Michael felt something shifting in his chest. Sarah's whispered conversation with the sleeping child revealed depths of tenderness that her professional persona had hidden, along with fears about parenting and loss that matched his own despite their different circumstances. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, stroking Emma's hair with the reverence of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be needed for comfort rather than efficiency. The healing that began that rainy evening was different from their earlier friendship. Less careful, more willing to acknowledge the messy reality of their feelings for each other alongside the responsibilities to their children. Sarah's decision to take a leave of absence from her principal position surprised everyone, including herself, but she explained it as necessary time to rebuild her relationship with Marcus and explore what it meant to parent with presence rather than just providing structure. Theodora's offer to fund her sabbatical came with no strings attached, his recognition that healing required space and time rather than just good intentions. Michael's acceptance of Sarah's help in getting his car repaired and finding more stable employment felt like a step toward the kind of interdependence that healthy relationships required. Neither charity nor complete independence, but the mutual support that people offered each other when they chose to build something together. 6 months later, the music room at Jefferson Elementary had become the heart of a community program that served children from across the district, funded by Theodore's foundation but managed by Sarah and Michael, working in partnership. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had expected, not the dramatic romance of fairy tales, but the steady companionship of two people who had learned to trust each other with their children's happiness and their own careful heart. Emma's voice had returned gradually, first in whispered songs during piano practice, then in quiet conversations with Marcus, finally in the confident melody of a child who had rediscovered the joy of being heard. Marcus had transformed from a defensive loner into a patient teacher for younger students, his musical ability becoming a bridge to confidence that extended far beyond the piano bench. The program's success was measured not in efficiency reports or test scores, but in the quality of connection between children who might otherwise never have met, in the way music created common ground across differences of language and circumstance and family structure. Sarah's administrative skills proved invaluable in ways she hadn't anticipated, not for maintaining institutional order, but for creating systems that supported relationships rather than replacing them. Her research and labor in translation and description, rather than replacing them, Michael's patient teaching style attracted students whose needs extended far beyond musical instruction, children who required the kind of attention that saw potential rather than just problems. Together, they had created something that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to healing through connection, rather than fixing through control. The evening that would become their new beginning started like any other community program night, with children and parents gathering in the music room for their weekly sharing session. Emma, now 10 and freely speaking, sat at the piano beside Marcus as they led the group through simple songs that everyone could join, regardless of musical experience. Theodore's presence had become a regular feature of these gatherings, his stories and compositions adding depth to the musical education, while his obvious pride in Sarah's work helped heal the rift that had separated them for so many years. Michael moved through the room with quiet authority, adjusting instruments and offering encouragement, while Sarah facilitated conversations that helped parents understand how music could strengthen families rather than just entertaining children. But it was the moment when Emma stood to perform Claire's completed lullaby, the song that had brought all their separate stories together, that the true significance of their journey became clear. Her clear voice filled the room with melody that carried love across time and loss, connecting past and present in ways that felt both miraculous and inevitable. Sarah watched Michael's face as he listened to his daughter sing his wife's words, seeing how pride and grief and gratitude could exist simultaneously in a heart large enough to hold them all. When Emma finished, the silence that followed was filled with the recognition that they had all been changed by this music, by the connections it had created, by the healing it had made possible through patience and faith, and the willingness to let love be more complicated than simple. Theodore's contribution to the final notes of their story came in the form of a confession that surprised even him, that he had been leaving anonymous gifts and completed compositions not just for Emma and Sarah, but for children throughout the community whose musical gifts might otherwise go unrecognized due to financial constraints or family circumstances that made lessons impossible. His wealth had found its purpose in creating opportunities for connection rather than just accumulating advantages, his artistic legacy living on through the young hands he helped guide to piano keys and the voices he encouraged to find their own melodies. The mystery of the Midnight Envelope had evolved into a systematic program of support that honored the privacy of families while ensuring that lack of resources would never silence a child's musical potential. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their belongings, Michael and Sarah found themselves alone in the music room with Emma and Marcus, the four of them naturally gravitating toward the piano that had orchestrated their convergence. They didn't speak about their relationship, didn't make declarations or promises about the future, but sat together in the comfortable silence of people who had learned that the most profound connections often existed beyond words. Emma's fingers found the keys first, playing the opening notes of Claire's lullaby, and one by one the others joined in, Marcus adding harmony, Sarah contributing a descant she remembered from her childhood, Michael providing the bass line that grounded them all. Their improvised family song filled the room with music that was imperfect and unrehearsed, but entirely their own, a melody that honored all the people who had brought them to this moment, while celebrating the new harmonies they were creating together. The final image of their story belonged to Emma, who had drawn throughout their musical evolution a series of pictures that told their story better than words ever could. Her latest drawing showed 5 figures around a piano, herself and Marcus at the bench, Michael and Sarah standing behind them, Theodore's presence represented by musical notes that flowed between all of them like visible love. But it was the detail she had added to this final picture that revealed the true depth of her understanding. Small figures representing all the other children from their community program, connected to the central group by streams of musical notes that suggested a network of connection extending far beyond their immediate family. In Emma's artistic vision, their healing had created ripples that would continue expanding, touching other families who needed reminding that music could bridge any distance, that love could transcend any loss, that sometimes the most beautiful melodies emerged from the willingness to harmonize rather than trying to sing alone.